Many people look at Africa today and see conflict, division, and political tension, and they often believe these problems are natural or caused by Africans themselves. But this idea is not only wrong, it hides the real story. The truth is that many of the conflicts we see across Africa today began long before modern African countries even existed, and long before Africans had the chance to decide how they wanted to live together. To understand why borders still create conflict across the continent, we must go back to a time when Africa was not divided into the countries we see today, and when decisions about African land were made far away by people who never lived there, never understood the cultures, and never planned to stay. Before colonial borders were drawn, Africa was not empty, chaotic, or without structure. African societies had their own systems of leadership, trade, justice, and cooperation that had developed over hundreds of years. Kingdoms rose and fell. Trade routes connected regions across deserts, forests, and seas. People migrated, mixed, and formed relationships based on shared language, culture, and history. Some groups lived peacefully side by side, others competed for land or influence, but these relationships were understood and managed through local systems. Conflict existed, but it was not frozen into rigid borders that turned disagreement into permanent division. This changed in the late 1800s, when European countries began competing aggressively for power, resources, and global influence. Europe was industrializing quickly, and factories needed raw materials like rubber, gold, copper, palm oil, and cotton. Africa had these resources in abundance, and because European powers had stronger weapons and ships, they believed they had the right to take control. Africa became a target not because it was weak or disorganized, but because it was rich, and because European nations were racing against each other to claim as much land as possible. In 1884, European leaders gathered in Berlin for what became known as the Berlin Conference. The purpose of the meeting was not to help Africa or bring peace to its people, but to prevent European countries from fighting each other while dividing African land. No African leader was invited to this meeting. No African voice was heard. Yet, decisions made in that room would shape the lives of millions for generations. Borders were drawn on maps using straight lines, rivers, and landmarks that made sense only to outsiders. Entire communities were split apart. Long-standing kingdoms were cut into pieces. Rival groups were forced together under one government. None of this was done with care for language, culture, or shared history. These borders were not designed to create unity or stability. They were designed for control. Colonial powers wanted borders that were easy to manage and defend, not borders that reflected how people actually lived. In many cases, a single ethnic group was divided between 2 or 3 different countries, while completely different groups were forced to live under one flag. This planted the seeds of tension that still exist today, because people were suddenly expected to see themselves as one nation without the shared identity, trust, or institutions needed to support that idea. Colonial rule made these problems worse instead of fixing them. European governments ruled through division, often favoring certain groups over others to maintain control. Groups that cooperated were rewarded with power, education, and jobs, while those that resisted were punished or excluded. This created deep resentment and inequality that did not disappear after independence. Schools were designed to train people to obey orders, not to think critically or lead. Roads and railways were built to move resources out of Africa, not to connect African communities to each other. Governments existed to serve colonial interests, not citizens. When independence finally came in the mid-1900s, many Africans celebrated with hope and pride. Flags were raised, anthems were sung, leaders promised unity, progress, and a better future. But independence arrived with a heavy burden. African countries inherited borders they did not choose, systems that were not built for them, and economies designed to export wealth rather than create it. Changing borders at that point risked endless wars, while keeping them meant accepting deep internal problems. Most leaders chose to keep the borders, believing that unity could be built over time. However, unity is difficult when people feel excluded, threatened, or ignored. In many countries, political power became a fight for survival, because controlling the state meant controlling jobs, land, security, and resources. Losing power often meant losing protection and opportunity. Elections became dangerous moments. Politics became ethnic. Trust disappeared. What looked like political competition was often rooted in fear created by borders that forced different groups into fragile systems with too much power at the center. Natural resources made this situation even more tense. Colonial borders often placed valuable resources like oil, diamonds, gold, and fertile land in specific regions. while profits were controlled by central governments or foreign companies. Local communities saw their land damaged, their environment destroyed, and their people remained poor while wealth flowed elsewhere. This led to anger, resistance, and violence in places like the Niger Delta, Eastern Congo, and parts of Sudan. These conflicts were not random. They were deeply connected to how borders, power, and resources were arranged. Africa is often blamed for these conflicts, with people pointing to tribalism, corruption, or poor leadership, but these explanations are incomplete. Africa was diverse long before colonial borders existed, and diversity alone does not cause violence. Corruption is real, but it grows easily in systems that were never designed to be fair or accountable. Many leaders struggled not because they lacked intelligence or vision, but because they were working inside structures designed for extraction, not unity. Despite all this, Africa has not stopped trying to move forward. Some countries have invested in education, built stronger institutions, and reduced ethnic tension through inclusion and shared national identity. Others are still struggling under the weight of history. Borders remain not because they work well, but because changing them could create even more chaos. Africa's conflicts are not proof of failure. They are the result of decisions made long ago by people who did not have to live with the consequences. Understanding this history helps us see Africa more clearly and more fairly. It reminds us that peace is not just about stopping violence, but about fixing systems. Until borders, power, and resources are managed in ways that include everyone, conflict will continue to return. Africa is not broken. It is carrying borders that were never meant to unite. And when we look at Africa today, it is easy to judge what we see on the surface, but history shows us that many of today's conflicts did not begin with the people who live there now. These borders did not only divide land, they divided trust, identity, and opportunity, and their effects did not disappear when independence arrived. Africa's borders remain powerful not because they work well, but because they are difficult to change. They continue to shape politics, control resources, and influence how people relate to one another. Conflict continues not because Africans cannot live together, but because unity is hard to build on foundations that were never designed to support it. Understanding this does not remove responsibility from leaders or societies, but it replaces blame with clarity and allows us to see the real roots of the problem. History does not disappear when flags change or governments fall. It lives on inside borders, institutions, and systems of power. Until these systems are understood and repaired, peace will always feel temporary and fragile. But understanding is the first step toward change, because once people see how the past shapes the present, they can begin to imagine a future built on better foundations. If this video helped you see Africa beyond the headlines, subscribe to WorldShape TV. More honest history is coming, stories about borders, money, power, and inequality, because the past still shapes the present, whether we notice it or not. Thanks for watching.